Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Language Empowered podcast. I'm Michael Farrelly, and this is a very special episode because for the first time, Tom, we're in the same room. And the reason for that is that we are the International Functional Congress, which is a conference being held in the fair city of Glasgow, which Tom is organising. Yeah, we're in the Congress opposite. Yeah. The Congress, and he's organising the Congress. And it's been a fantastic conference so far. We have been watching a colloquium of a series of papers from some excellent academics working on the idea of language and climate change, sustainability, ecology, and so on. And there was the panel was called Changing Climate, Changing Discourse. So we thought it'd be an idea that people contributing to that panel to continue their conversation about discourse, language, and climate change and the work they presented. It was really interesting yesterday to watch the panel. But many of the people from that panel are here today around the table. Not everybody, unfortunately, could be here today, but we've got some excellent people to chat with. To start, we're going to let everybody introduce themselves. Very briefly, if you could say who you are, where you're from, and what you have been doing at the conference. That would be fantastic.
My name is Paul White. I'm at the University of Aix-Marseille in the south of France. I finished my PhD a couple of years ago, which I looked into NGO discourse, like Greenpeace and some smaller groups as well, comparing kind of social issue activism with environmental activism. I've written a couple of papers comparing Greenpeace discourse in English and in French. And at the conference, I took a course in Marseille about the ecological society of tomorrow. And the conclusion so far is that we're not really on a good path, and that we need radical change to all societal structures. And I got reading about the application of psychology to environmental discourse. And I'm at the very start of this now, but I found it interesting that they kind of avoid dichotomy of good guys, bad guys, playing blame game and all this stuff by positing the possibility that the crisis is so enormous and is already started and kind of doesn't seem to be slowing in any way. For different societal actors, from oil companies to NGOs to politicians, etc., the truth is just too scary and dangerous to actually confront consciously. So these different people engage in psychological avoidance strategies, and that's where all this kind of techno solution discourse and stuff comes from.
Yeah. And that was an unusual take, because you're saying people often in the critical discourse analysis, it's seen as these companies are deliberately denying something.
Yeah.
And you're sort of taking, well, actually, maybe it's just a psychological avoidance of talking about the issue because it's too terrible to think about.
Well, in fact, just after my talk yesterday, somebody said, maybe this can excuse environmentally damaging discourse. But I don't think the approach of psychology is to understand it on a deeper level to be able to combat it, rather than just saying these guys are bad.
Yeah. And you were talking about techno addiction to the technology or false on it. It's quite interesting to maybe come back to that. So the next person around our table, you say who you are?
Hi, my name is Daniel Fryer. I work at Stakeholder University College in Norway. And as part of the colloquium, I presented with my two colleagues, John Curry and Ben Clark. And we talked about looking at the discourse of climate activists, in this particular case, how they conceptualize or represent nature in their various forms of communication, particularly online communication. And I'm also really interested in and done some work on the criminalization of the environmental movement and some of its historical connections as well. Particularly the group Earth First, started in 1980, and the so-called Green Scare in the United States. That's also really interesting. In the colloquium, we were looking at how activists represent nature, some of the typical ways and some perhaps the atypical ways of doing so.
Yeah, fantastic.
My name's John Curry, PhD candidate at the University College in Norway and also at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Daniel just described the paper that I presented yesterday, but that forms part of my PhD project, which is about how climate change activists and politicians in the UK talk about climate change and kind of makes comparison across time as well.
That's really interesting. Thank you.
Hi there. My name is Cinzia Victoria. I'm from University of Bologna for the campus. I've been working on climate change representation for the last 15 years or so. For this colloquium, my colleague, Jim Johnson, for not here today, and myself, starts a new project on equimotions. And partly it's connected to the idea of psychological, environmental psychology in particular. And we thought it would be good to have a, linguistic discourse perspective in that kind of thing. There's lots of work going on in terms of sociological research. Option is one, emotional labor, environmental psychology, like environmental philosophy, so eco-anxiety, eco-price, or nostalgia, all the time new lexicon, which is not, I think there's a gap from discursive, critical discursive, positive discursive, linguistic discourse, and analytical perspectives. We want to tap in that kind of thing. And so our take on emotions, again, we changed the perspectives because we collected a couple of years ago a big corpus on climate change non-fiction, which we have a wide range of books, starting with Rachel Carson back in 1960 up to Greta Thunberg 2022. And then we selected a few books there and want to see how people, readers, reacted. So what kind of emotional reactions they had towards these theme books. So this is the area we explored, coming up with kind of, whether people, readers in that case, felt in a way inspired, empowered, since this is a podcast about language and power. So what kind of language resources they used in terms of feeling empowered, disempowered to do something about environment. So that's the kind of implications that followed our study, because we thought, okay, going to begin with language first to see the kind of meaning being instantiated in this text. Yes, I think we need to understand first what happens there and then discuss the implication afterwards. So basically, more or less, summarize.
Yep. Brilliant.
Hopefully,
Yep. Thank you. And nice one. Hello, everyone. I'm Matteo Foi from the University of Birmingham. And yesterday I presented a paper on corporate discourse on climate change, specifically looking at how the world's most polluting corporations, mainly fossil fuel companies, discursively represent the crisis. They represent climate change, how they position themselves in relation to it, how they discursively construe their role in addressing climate change, and how they essentially, what kind of solutions they propose. So that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
The main finding coming out of it is that these companies, many of whom used to engage in overt climate change denialism, including funding climate change denialism and supporting it through lobbying activities everywhere, they are less explicitly denying climate change, for they have other ways downplaying the effects or for reframing things as risks, modulating the probability of the worst case scenarios to happen. So there is a more sneaky form of denialism that is less in your face, but perhaps for that reason are dangerous.
Hello, I'm Catherine Rosso from the University of Naples Orientale. I've been interested in climate change discourse for quite some time. I started looking at the evaluation of risk in climate change discourse, especially climate-induced migration and populist discourse as well. In this great colloquium, I spoke about hate and solidarity in X discourse during the Australian Black Summer crisis. I was interested in seeing what drove people to divide or create some sort of solidarity, because I think it's really important to think, we are all in this crisis together. People usually reason and are probably divided in the way they think about climate change, because we come from very different places and have very different possibilities. What I found was very interesting in that it could not be possible to think about this in terms of hate speech on one side and positive solidarity on the other side, or at least what came through was that people, for instance, hate speech were regarded not only conspiracy theories, you'd say, but also perhaps being divided against Australia and people supporting the Australians during the crisis because they were saying that was a privileged crisis against other crises, for instance, in Pakistan. And on the other side, for instance, in positive solidarity, it was mainly about Indigenous peoples and looking for solutions. but it was often disempowering because it was like a call to let's look for knowledge, let's look for alternatives to progress through colonial process and so on. But it wasn't really, they weren't really in an active position. So I think when we're doing work, thinking about ideation and interpersonal couplings with crisis, we should also bring the critical side into it a little bit.
Right. Hi, I'm Gerard O'Grady. I'm a functional linguist from Cardiff. My interest was basically as a reader. I was reading, on consuming media and realizing that there was a problem in the media. And the problem was not overt climate change, but what I would call tacit climate change denial. I wanted to investigate a corpus of British newspapers, and so I did, looking at them from over the year 2024 and the first month, January 2025, to see did they recognize climate change denial? And they did, because they talked about, planetary boundaries cannot be breached. They talked about the dangers of that, but what solutions were proposed? And my preferred solution would be a radical economic shift to something like a degrowth economy. So I just wanted to investigate that. This, of course, was an idea that none of the newspapers, regardless of whether it was so-called liberal, centre, Britain doesn't have a left-wing newspaper. That's a problem. And they very much, either through different grammatical means, backgrounded degrowth approaches, or they evaluated it very negatively. So that's as far as I got. So I was trying to work out then what they were actually offering as a solution. This is where I haven't had time to really work on this. But it does seem that what they're offering is very much this idea of there will be a technological future someday, somewhere, soon. Someone will invent this magic thing that will make it okay. So we can go on with our lives. Don't worry about it, because someday it will all be okay. I find this a really depressing situation that we're in. And I actually find it incredibly dangerous, because it's quite easy to combat a climate change denier because you can actually have an argument with them. But here you're dealing with people who will say, yes, of course we accept that the world should stay within 2 degrees, but we cannot radically change our economy. And we've got a government, for example, in this country that believes in growth. And all they're really positing is growth, 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 based on this ridiculous 1930s measure of GDP. Plus, the only real environmental project they have is the carbon capture plant, which is a fallacy. But that's the media that we've got. And I think it goes back to what you were saying, that this is now where a lot of the money is going. It's being basically channeled into supporting these type of things, at the same time while they're still funding very dubious politicians who overtly deny things.
Yeah, and sorry if I can just jump in. What we found in our study is a lot of that techno optimism in corporate discourse, especially like.
I don't know if it's techno optimism or techno fantasy. I don't necessarily think these people believe it. Because I was thinking about was the Frankfurt School notion of instrumental rationality, something that makes sense in the short term. And if you're a capitalist, it does make sense to make money in the next 5 years.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, what the things I was reading about was saying that this, technical solutions kind of offers comfort and reassurance today, especially when it's related to future projects, which is not actually, what the project can deliver or will maybe not deliver, but it's just about a kind of psychological comfort approach to strategy. And that's maybe, I'm not saying that that's what the writer does, but that's the impact on the reader, at least the thing from the audience.
Yeah, there's a really clear, I think, line between at least 3 of those papers are on this idea. I like that phrase of tacit climate denial. That seems like a very important observation to even call that out and give it a name and a very clear. So I wondered if, and then we've also got the kind of activist and what are people outside the corporate sphere doing about this? I guess the way that this room's fallen is kind of along those lines. But I wondered if the people that had worked on the corporate stuff first, could you give any concrete examples that the audience could grasp to get an idea of exactly what kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah. So in my case, there are 2 patterns that come to mind that kept cropping up in the corpus. One was the combination of very
confident or clear acknowledgements about the reality of climate change with a more hedged framing of the issue as risks, as possibility, using words like risk or using possibility models to present it and present the outcomes of climate change, the damage that it could bring as a possibility in the future, not as a definitive and absolutely certain scenario. And then the other thing was a lot of blame spreading and blame shifting, where they were referring to climate change is a global problem requiring global solutions. So, and obviously that flies in the face of the fact that the main cause of climate change is the product that they're selling. So there's a real tension there, I think, a real discursive tension. And it's about control. Like, what kind of future are we envisioning, right? They hardly ever talked about deep reform of their business model away from fossil fuels. It was more about redressing the current situation, something that, through efficiency improvements, through new technologies like carbon capture, will just sort itself out. And to support this thesis, they talk about how projections show that the world will still need fossil fuels for decades to come. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, really.
Interesting. I've had a quote from Shell's sustainability report of 2022 saying, digitalization and innovation are central to our approach to reducing emissions. And from both the linguistic and psychological approach, I think the terms within general society, the terms digitalization and innovation, invoke kind of positive evaluation, positive attitude. So it's like, this is how it's a comfort. It makes you feel good, but it could be completely devoid of actual concrete meaning. Okay, this is just one random quote for this.
I was just wondering about this because in previous readings, I found that risk was always put together with opportunity. Of course, the corporate reports need to abide with political policies and so on. They're doing it because they have to, in a way. I don't know if you found that.
Keeping investors happy.
Yes,
of course.
exactly.
Yeah. What you're saying points to a tension between the needs of different stakeholders. So you have the general public who's anxious about climate change, at least in the majority, and investors anxious about not getting the expected return on their investment in the company. So you have language that tries to square the circle, where climate change is reframed as an opportunity for growth. So going back.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say something very much like that. For example, there's the money going into research to ameliorate climate change. And some of the language that's been used is, for example, we're looking for game changers. We're looking for moving on the edge of the possible. But all they're really doing is reifying the current system. It has to be understood that the stakeholders in these corporations, the directors, are legally required to make profits. That's a very big issue.
It also came up in recent research I did with Donna Miller, so comes up soon, on all stakeholders in this corporate discourse, the we company's position. So again, in terms of kind of language being used or position, the stakeholders, who is the stakeholder? And how language, kind of linguistic resources, empowered what we think is these empowering the stakeholders themselves in order to bring up discourses, putting in the foreground the role of the company and what they do, positively assessing themselves in terms of what they're doing to respond to this increasing pressure, even by rules of regulation. Think European Union, for example, in which these corporate reports used to be voluntary, past, now more binding, but still work to do that. Yeah.
You mentioned those types of document regulations on them, and just you said about you've looked at newspapers as well. So where do you find these?
Yeah, so these are sustainability reports, sometimes referred to as CSR reports. There's a new subgenre. There is the climate report. These are documents that are, to some extent, voluntary, to some extent, increasingly being regulated by other bodies, where
companies provide detail about what they're doing to address
Disclosures.
what they do about climate change, but not only climate change, different kinds of environmental issues and stakeholder issues. They're, publicly available on these companies' websites. There are also websites that collect them, which make them a valuable resource for linguistic analysis because they're quite easy to get hold of.
John and Daniel, your text that you looked at for the colloquium yesterday, there were also news representation.
No, they were taken from climate activists' websites. It was things like news, updates, blogs, and press releases as well. So just,
Yeah. And so then again, we've got kind of divide between, this is the Language of Power podcast. And on one side, you've got people who have got power, the corporations and governments, and people who are seeking to disrupt the power in terms of activism and so on. And I wondered if that is the case, what effect do you all see the documents and texts that we're looking at having? So if somebody was to say, well, what difference does it make what people say in these documents? How would you respond to that kind of question?
I think it makes quite a large difference, regardless of whether people read them, because there's something that policymakers can then claim that's being done. And as for newspapers, it is setting the agenda. So it's not really a question for this uptake. The fact that they're there gives legitimization of those channels of discourse in a certain way.
I think it's also a reflection on what is acceptable in society. And if you can have these discourses of greenwashing and stuff like that publicly published by these companies, and reflect something across society internally.
But maybe it's what you were talking about as well to psychology. It makes people feel good. Something's been done, so I don't have to do anything, even though nothing has been done.
Yeah. And especially avoids you feeling bad by completely the crisis and how out of control it is.
I did some work on political communication and policies at the EU level on the connection between health and climate change. And it was interesting to see in our work that while certain crises didn't need legitimization, climate change always did. So investment in climate change, like with the next EU recovery and resilience, we always found patterns of, people, they needed, the people to believe in these investments and a lot of patterns of legitimization or due to that. It's interesting that happened. So it's not a given if you want.
Can I take that question one further? So Michael's analysis, you were looking at more sophisticated analysis of these discourse in terms of how straightforward denial represented the world in a certain way. They've got cleverer, and you're looking at new things to work out how this denial is done tacitly, but also bringing in sociology, which Sarah did, and politics sociology yesterday, which Sarah did, but hasn't meant so much today, but also the psychological aspect and coming in from other fields. Cynthia, you talked about putting the discourse analysis first. We already do the discourse, and so it's important for us, but it's also quite often we just do the discourse and don't bring in these other fields, so that's a bit of an extension. So my next question is not, Michael asks how those texts affected behaviour of people. What does your analysis do to change anything?
That is the colour. And we've been talking about that probably for about 20 years. I think you give a different answer than I will. I think what you can do is you could try to shift the ground, because I'm very much a materialist and I don't feel that discourse analysis alone can do all that much. But for example, there was a really good quote, I think it was in yours, when you gave an example of a company talking about reducing emissions by 50%. In an economy that's growing, over that time frame, that will probably be equivalent of saying that they're growing their emissions 2 or 3 times. So I think we can basically bang these points home and try to set an agenda that people can then consider. I think the movement has to be
Something like critical language awareness.
It has to be critical and go out there, and the communities have to react to it.
I'd like to think that what we're doing right now is at least a piece of that puzzle in that activity of disseminating research findings. Obviously, there's a lot more that we could all do in terms of communicating what we find in our research, and hopefully it will reach the people in a position to be able to contain, for instance, the power of these corporations through regulation, and hopefully also empower activists to have
science or evidence-based knowledge to make their point even more compelling.
Can I just go off track for a minute? About 10 years ago, I was on a project where we set up something called the Evidence Information Center of EIS. It wasn't Center, maybe WES stands.
Sent to the American spelling with the S,
Yeah, could be, yeah. We got quite a bit of money to do this. We got constituents to interview all the MPs and to talk about the use of evidence in the UK. We published a few things on it, including in The Guardian and a couple of academic pieces. But it went nowhere because politicians just would not engage with evidence. And then the Brexit thing came in when evidence went out the window. One of the things we got from talking to politicians, and more importantly to the civil servants, was that politicians never want to say where the sources of their information come from because they never want anybody else to know what they're thinking. So they may want to get information against them, but they never want to share it. So academics weren't interested because academics couldn't get credit for giving this evidence to this group.
I was just thinking about what you said yesterday about deep engagement. So what I'm trying to do is, if you study how news, for instance, is recontextualized in social media and you see how people are reacting to certain frames, like crisis frames, I think that could be interesting to look at that other side, because really, as we were saying beforehand, climate change can be seen as a very elitarian discourse. And given everything is happening around the world, and we've been seeing, on the other side of the Atlantic, what is happening. I mean, we need to understand what is happening. And also sometimes people who think they're climate change supporters, but are not using the right frames to mobilize action. And so, for instance, as we've been seeing, Shitsa fantastically put it yesterday, fits that like fear and so on. I think we do have a position and we can do something.
That picks it. So you were talking about the psychological aspect.
Yes.
Of it, the fact that maybe the people producing these texts, this is a comfort blanket for them rather than a dirty strategy, possibly. But a lot of things that have come up in your talk, but also some of the talks we had today, was some of the counter discourses actually might be counterproductive and therefore counter discourses and therefore if you induce too much fear, people become paralyzed and can't act.
So just to put flesh on that bow, using words like the climate crisis may have the effect of preventing action. I just have two quick things to say, one to reply to that and one to the previous question. So within the things I read about eco-psychology, the recommendations were the opposite. To avoid this positive discourse analysis, build them really to confront the horror of the situation, because otherwise you don't get to the non-unthought, is what it is called in psychology. You don't confront what our actual societal situation is. So I don't know. I think there are different positions on, is it enough just to call it a crisis instead of change? From the perspective of the things I've read, they would say, no, that's not enough. Just changing one label is not going to work. Coming back to the question just quickly on the impact of our research. In France, a few years ago, they mandated that every university student has to have a certain level of English to finish their bachelor's course. That was good for me. More teaching jobs for English teachers, but very commercially minded, like international business and stuff like that. Whereas now they've mandated that every university has to follow a course in ecology. So there are lots of university professors who don't really have a very developed idea of psychology. So I'm working with a publishing house in Marseille that publish on ecological issues. And we think that one of the ways into the subject is through discourse first, is through analysis of discourse. Then you can also touch on other things that we were saying earlier, philosophy, psychology, other different humanities, sciences. But discourse is a good way to show how it's relevant.
Interesting. Daniel, I was just thinking about who we may potentially impact with the research we're doing. We've mentioned like lots of different stakeholders, but also for me, and maybe quite personally, this idea of almost as a kind of activism with other researchers around me, people in similar fields to me, maybe working on slightly different areas, may not be thinking about climate discourse quite so much. So I think we're also doing something, let's say, within the research community or communities that we're connected to, about raising things there. So we're reaching out. This podcast hopefully reaches out to lots of other people, but we're also talking to each other and bringing up things like, for example, those who work on corporate discourse, which is not something I'm familiar with, looking for those connections. How is this discussed by an oil company versus how is this discussed by good activists? And that's really fascinating.
I remember just working with some people to do with coastal sustainability, for example, and things that we just read part of our discipline that we take for granted sometimes be quite shocking to other people. Like they say, well, why don't you just say it like this? And you say, oh, precarity or resilience, those are tricky concepts. And they go, are they? I thought they were really straightforward concepts. Affecting people like that can be really interesting.
Let's not forget that we're all educators as well as researchers. These ideas, the findings from our research percolate into our teaching and hopefully to our students. And it will not resonate with everyone, obviously, but at least they'll provoke some critical thinking and some thoughtfulness in our students.
Yeah, definitely. I think picking up on these ideas, connecting communities in ways, I think raises the issue of public engagement as well. I think getting people with, different projects, not, academia or different areas, get involved around, the kind of idea of a project in terms of how should we change or possibly think a possible different future, maybe, and a different present as well.
I mean, so truth is, in the early 2000s, almost no corporation used to publish sustainability reports. That's a major, discursive shift that's happened in the last couple of years. And I think a lot of it is greenwashing. A lot of it is kind of impression management. But if nobody challenges that, the discourse will stay the same. So I think it's important. That's part of our role to raise red flags where they need to be raised.
I know that I'm really sorry I can't remember the URL, but I know there is a website where people investigate CSR report statements and compare it to what they know about what the company is actually doing to track over time how sincere Discourse actually is.
If you can find that, we'll publish it.
I will look for it again. And the results are positive in the sense that in 2025, they said about 25% of them align with the reality of what the company is actually doing, which is up from what? 0. That, of course, it's, in my opinion, far too gradual. Right. Yeah. There are people investigating the reality of greenwashing.
Okay. I had a question really for Gerard. I was thinking about this counter discourse thing and like the idea of degrowth. I thought before, because I mean, like, yeah, maybe it's hard to answer, I guess, but like, I mean, obviously, like, terms like growth, obviously, just seem like positive for most people. Like,
well, it is, but I mean, it's very simple narrative. For example, within a biological life frame, you grow from a child to an adult, but you don't keep growing. If you do, you hit that ceiling. There's a saying that if you believe in unlimited growth, you're either an economist or a fool. I can't remember who said that, but I like it. Every system must have a balance. The only thing I can think of in nature that actually grows and doesn't stop is cancer. I think that's something that needs to be introduced into the economic discourse, because the economic discourse doesn't factor in externalities. What they price in is not really the price of a product. That's our taxes that have to clean up afterwards.
There are challenges with the idea of degrowth. I think
Massive challenges.
I agree that it's probably what we need, but getting there is hard because a lot of our societal and welfare systems are founded on the idea that tax revenue is going to go up, especially with aging populations.
Yes.
This is a massive challenge. So the first thing that is going to get hit is healthcare.
Well, that's
or defense in an increasingly conflict-ridden world. Where do you? I think following on our discussion at the panel yesterday, I think there are pockets of extreme wealth that need to be tapped into to redress the real problem at the heart of this, which is inequality. I think that's where the money is. But even that is because
that's the answer. I mean, you don't just introduce degrowth, because if you do, you have a problem with resource allocation. That's really what it means, resource allocation. the idea isn't, for example, to say, okay, distributed justice. The idea isn't to say, for example, last year the country grew by 2%, so now we have to grow by 1%, and the next year it's by 0%. That would be nonsense. Degrowth it should be an outcome of a different process, which is a social justice, a redistributive program. There should be no billionaires in the world. There's no reason for there to be a billionaire in the world. You know, it saddens me from another one. Some of you will know I'm very interested. I'm very actively involved in another political campaign involving Palestine at the moment. And it saddens me that no one's even talking about the carbon that the IDF, the so-called IDF, are actually inflicting on the world. They've just polluted the world as well as killing lots of people, and it's not even being discussed. You know, everything is connected. I mean, the whole of society has to be transformed. That is risky because that is incredibly frightening, and we find it as a species almost impossible to imagine things of that scale. But the point is, we don't have a choice.
And to bring it back to the language, growth is a metaphor, and it's not often that we go behind the metaphor. So what exactly do you mean when you say economic growth? There's a multitude of processes, measures, and so on that kind of then come up with this figure we call growth
GDP
or not. So there's a whole lot of discursive work going on that then is distilled into this one word that, as somebody said earlier, just sounds positive. In many cases,
the stupid thing is, for example, if a hurricane hits tomorrow, because of the amount of reconstruction that will go on, that will actually increase Britain's GDP. So Britain will grow because of the disaster. But that's a narrative that the average person doesn't get to hear. And that's the problem. So not all growth by necessarily even results in, for example, funding welfare systems, because, for example, that would very much depend on the political ideology of whoever's controlling money and distributing the money. So that's where it comes with the power.
I think this has been a really fantastic discussion. You started this discussion yesterday with you giving your academic papers questions to each other. I think you've continued it really wonderfully here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the podcast. Don't forget to have a look at the podcast website, languageandpowerpodcast.org, where you can find a written blog as well as the back catalogue of all our previous episodes. Also, if you're interested in learning more about methods of critical discourse analysis, enhancing your understanding of critical discourse analysis, have a look at discourseacademy.org, where you can find courses, blogs, and one-to-one sessions all about discourse. See you next time.